The north wind had no respect for the calendar. It came down from the Canadian Shield long before the almanac called for it. A thief in October, stealing the last of the weak autumn sun from the Montana Territory. The valley, cupped between the jagged gray teeth of the mountains, funneled the wind, making it scream. Winter did not arrive here. It laid siege. The small town, hardly more than a crossroads with a church steeple, lived by the rhythm of its three vital organs: the sanctuary, the general store, and the post office. News, carried by that same north wind, passed from one to the other, gaining substance with each telling. Gossip was the only thing that moved faster than the cold. Jack Thornton felt the cold in his hands, which were cracked and raw from mending the northern fence line. He was a capable man, broad in the shoulder and quiet in the way of men who spend more time with cattle than with people. He owned this ranch, a middling spread of longhorns that were his livelihood but not his life. His life, he felt, had ended 2 years ago. He was just a man left standing after the fire, breathing in the ash, and he carried the guilt of the survivor in every step. He finished stretching the wire, his movements economical and sure. He looked out at the herd, already bunched together for warmth, their heads low against the weather. His first thought, his only clear purpose, was keeping them alive until spring. His second thought, the one that sat like a stone in his gut, was keeping his daughter, Emma, alive. That was his surface goal: get through the winter. His deeper, unspoken aim was something he could not face. It was the question of how to live at all, how to move his feet one after the other without the crushing weight of his sin. He walked back to the ranch house. It was a solid log structure his own hands had built, but it looked brittle against the vast, darkening sky. The smoke that rose from the chimney was a thin, gray wisp, just enough to keep the damp out, not enough to offer comfort. He pushed the door open, his spurs silent on the packed dirt of the yard. The kitchen was the first room, and it was the coldest, the great black iron stove, a modern thing Mary had been so proud of, stood as a monument to what was gone. It was a dead heart. On a wooden peg by the door, a faded calico apron hung, perfectly still. It had not been touched since the day he had folded it and placed it there. It was her legacy. That and the silence. Emma was at the table. She was 8 years old, but small, a wisp of a thing with her mother's dark hair and his own serious eyes. She was reading from a tattered primer, her lips moving silently. She had been left without a mother's hand, and it showed in the tight, functional braids Jack wrestled into her hair each morning, in the way she was too clean, too quiet. She was the moral compass of his broken world. The only reason he mended the fence or rode to town. She looked up when he entered, her gaze level. She did not smile. This house had forgotten the shape of smiles. He grunted a greeting. Hanging his hat, he asked if she was cold. She shook her head, a small, practiced lie they both understood. He moved to the stove and began the clumsy ritual of supper. He stirred the pot of oatmeal left from breakfast, adding water to thin the gray paste. He cut slices from a side of salt pork. The smell of it frying was just the smell of fuel, not of food, not of a home, while the meat hissed. Jack stared out the small window over the dry sink. His gaze went past the barn, beyond the frozen creek, to the solitary cottonwood tree on the rise. Its branches were bare, skeletons reaching for the sky. Beneath it was a single mound of earth, now dusted with the first snow. A plain wooden cross stood at its head. Mary, and buried with her, the son who had never taken an inrushing breath. The guilt came, predictable as the sunset. It was a physical thing, a cold pressure in his chest. He had been strong enough to break through the blizzard, to ride for the doctor in town. But the storm had been stronger. He had returned, half frozen, to a house steeped in a terrible, final silence. He had lost them both. He was the one left, and he did not know why. He had not truly lived a day since. He just managed. The next morning, he told Emma to keep the fire fed. He had to ride for supplies. The small settlement was hunkered down against the wind. The false fronts of the buildings looked like a child's forgotten toys. He tied his horse to the hitching rail outside the general store, the wind tearing at his coat. He stepped inside, the jingle of the bell over the door sounding unnaturally loud. The air inside was thick with the scent of kerosene, dried apples, coffee beans, and oiled wood. Mistress Henley was at the counter, her fingers sorting a box of lace ribbons. She was a woman whose kindness was a weapon. Her eyes, sharp and bright, latched onto him before he was halfway to the counter. She was one of the town's eyes. She moved toward him, her hands clasped, her face a mask of practiced concern. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her voice dripping with pity. "How are you truly managing out there? All alone?" He hated the way she said alone, as if it were a disease. He nodded to her, his face set. "Mistress Henley." She pressed on, ignoring his coldness. And that poor child. Little Emma. It is not right, a girl her age, without a woman's hand to guide her. She must be a sorrowful sight. Her words were needles, probing for the soft places, for the gossip that would be discussed after church on Sunday. Any man who deviated from the norm, any household that was not complete, became a topic for their moral speculation. Jack's voice was flat, cold as the iron on his stove. "We are managing." He turned to the shopkeeper. "I need flour, coffee, and beans." From the corner, by the pot-bellied stove, another man rose. Deacon Ferris. He was the town's other eye, its moral authority. He was a thick, solid man whose face seemed set in permanent judgment. He gave Jack a short nod, a gesture that felt less like a greeting and more like an assessment. "The Lord tests us." "Mr. Thornton," the deacon said, his voice a low rumble. "He tests us with hardship to see if we are worthy." Jack felt the man's gaze on him, weighing him, finding him wanting. "Solitude can be a balm," the deacon continued, warming his hands over the heat. "But it can also sour a man. It can lead a good man into dark paths if he is not vigilant." The implication hung in the air, thick as the smell of tobacco. A man alone, a child alone. It was a situation that needed correction. It was an imbalance in the town's ledger. Jack paid for his supplies, his jaw tight. The weight of their scrutiny felt heavier than the 50-pound sack of flour he hauled to his shoulder. This was the community. It did not come to the ranch to help mend his fence or check on his daughter. It waited in the warmth of the general store to pass its judgment. The ride home was brutal. The wind had teeth now, and it seemed to whisper their words back to him. Poor child. Alone. Dark paths. He knew what they thought. He was a man with a cold house, a man failing in his duties. He rode into the yard and saw Emma's small face in the window, watching for him. He felt a rush of fierce, protective anger, followed immediately by a wave of inadequacy. He put the supplies away in the pantry. The flour sack sat on the counter, a pale, lifeless thing. He thought of bread. Mary had always been baking bread. The smell of it used to fill the house, a promise of warmth and life. The kitchen had been the heart of everything. Steam on the windows, the scent of yeast. Emma playing on the floor with wooden spoons. Now the flour would be for him to make hard, dense biscuits, fuel to get them through another day. The memory was not a comfort. It was a knife. He looked at the empty apron on its peg, a symbol of his failure. He was terrified of betraying her memory, so he lived in a tomb of his own making. That night, they ate their meal of stringy salt pork and cold biscuits in silence. The kitchen was vast and shadowy around their small circle of lantern light. "Emma," he said, trying to break the quiet. She looked up, waiting. "Did you read your book?" "Yes, Papa, I read about the Pilgrims." He nodded. "That is good." The conversation died. The only sounds were the scraping of forks on tin plates and the relentless shriek of the wind outside. He knew this was not enough. He was failing her. Emma was becoming as gray and silent as the landscape. She needed light, warmth, conversation. She needed things he no longer possessed. His love for her was a deep, powerful ache, but it was frozen, trapped beneath the thick ice of his guilt. He could not be happy, because to be happy would be to betray Mary, to let another woman into this house. To even think of it felt like a sin. So he remained frozen, and he was freezing his daughter along with him. Later, he went to the barn to check on the horses. The smell of hay and warm animals was a small comfort. The leather of the saddles, dry and creaking, was a familiar, honest thing. He leaned against the stall, listening to the storm. He felt like a man waiting. He did not know what for. He was waiting for the spring, or for the end of things. He was waiting for something to break, either the weather or him. He went back inside, the cold clinging to him. He climbed the stairs to the small loft where Emma slept. He tucked the blankets around her thin shoulders. Her face was pale in the sliver of moonlight coming through the icy window. She looked at him, her gaze direct, holding a wisdom that frightened him. "Papa," her voice was a thread of sound. He grunted, smoothing her hair. She waited a beat, as if gathering the courage. "Will the kitchen ever be warm again?" The question struck him, landing harder than the deacon's judgment or Mistress Henley's pity. He said, "I will put more wood in the stove before I sleep." She shook her head. A small, sad motion on the pillow. "No, I mean warm." He had no answer for that. He leaned down and kissed her forehead. It was cold. He went back down the stairs. The house was utterly silent, a hollow space defined by the sound of the wind. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark, his hands resting on the rough wood. He stared at the black, cold mass of the stove. It was the heart of the home, and it was dead, and he did not know how to light it again. He woke before the sun, as he always did, the habit of grief and responsibility. The air in his small bedroom was so cold it stung his lungs. He sat on the edge of the cot, the floorboards ice beneath his bare feet. He pulled on his trousers and wool shirt in the dark, his movements stiff. He expected the usual silence, the deep, dead cold of the house, the hollow sound of his own breathing. But something was wrong. It was not a sound, it was a smell. He froze, his hand halfway to his boots. It was a ghost, a scent that had no right to be here. It was the smell of yeast, of warmth, of things baking. It was the smell of Mary. He moved out of the room, his stockinged feet silent on the stairs. The chill of the house hit him, but beneath it, coming from the kitchen, was a low, radiating warmth, and a sound, a soft, rhythmic thump and scrape, thump and scrape. He stopped at the bottom of the stairs. His gun belt hung on the peg by the door. His heart was a cold knot in his chest. A squatter. A drifter pushed in by the storm. His hand went to the belt, his fingers wrapping around the cold, familiar grip of the revolver. He stepped into the kitchen doorway and stopped. The big iron stove, the dead heart of his home, was alive. A low orange glow leaked from its grate, and the stovetop radiated a heat that pushed back the morning. A lantern was lit, sitting on the counter, casting a warm yellow circle. And in that circle of light was a woman. Her back was to him. She was standing at Mary's work table, the table he had not been able to bring himself to clear of its old, dry clutter. It was clean now. And on it, she was working a massive mound of pale dough. Her arms, covered in faded calico, were dusted with flour to the elbows. She pushed her weight into the dough, folded it, and pushed again. Thump, scrape. The smell was overwhelming. It was bread. It was life. It filled the empty spaces of the room. It filled the 2-year hole in his chest, and it made him furious. He raised the pistol, his voice a low, hard rasp that tore the warm silence. "Who are you?" The woman did not scream. She did not jump. Her hands simply stopped moving, resting in the soft dough. She took a slow breath, her shoulders rising and falling. Then, slowly, she turned. She was not young, but not old. Her face was plain, worn by sun and hardship, but it was strong. Her eyes, a steady gray, met his. They were tired, profoundly tired, but held no fear. She looked at the gun in his hand, then back at his face. He barked the question again, stepping fully into the room. "Who let you in?" The door was not barred, she said. Her voice was low and cracked with the cold. "Where did you come from?" "The barn. I slept in the hay. It was warmer than the wind." He did not lower the gun. "This is my house. That is my flower. You are a thief." Her gaze did not waver. She looked past him, toward the stairs. "I came in when the sun was still down. The fire in the stove was nothing but gray ash. The child, she was awake upstairs. I heard her cough." This confused him. He said, "What business is that of yours?" She looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of something sharp appeared in her eyes. "Your daughter was hungry." The word struck him dumb. It was an accusation, but said as a simple fact. It turned the tables on him. He was the master of the house, holding the gun. But she was the one who had seen the hunger he had normalized. She had lit the fire he had let die. A small sound came from the stairway. "Emma." She was standing on the bottom step, a thin cotton nightgown hanging on her small frame. She was pale, her dark hair unbraided and wild around her face. She was not looking at Jack. She was staring, wide-eyed, at the stove. She was staring at the impossible, wonderful warmth that filled the room. Her mouth was slightly open. Jack's voice softened, but was still firm. "Emma, go back to your room." Emma did not move. Her gaze shifted from the stove to the woman, then to the massive, beautiful cloud of dough on the table. The woman turned her head slightly. "Good morning, Emma," she said, her voice softer than it had been for him. "The biscuits will be ready soon." Emma's face, usually so small and serious, transformed. A slow, hesitant light spread across her features. It was a look Jack had not seen since Mary. He felt a painful, angry lurch in his chest. He snapped at his daughter. "Emma, I told you, go!" Emma finally looked at him. She saw the gun in his hand, pointed at the woman. Her small face crumpled, not in fear, but in protest. "Papa," she said, her voice suddenly clear and strong, cutting through the tension. She stepped off the stair, onto the cold floor, and took 2 steps toward the woman. "She makes the house happy. Papa, let her stay." The words, so simple, so direct, hit Jack Thornton with the force of a physical blow. Happy, a foreign word from a foreign land. He stared at his daughter, this small, 8-year-old creature who had just passed a judgment he could not refute. He slowly, uncertainly, lowered the gun. Though he did not holster it, he looked at the woman. His mind was racing, trying to catch up. He saw the full wood box by the stove. Wood she must have carried from the porch. He saw the coffee pot, already sitting on the warming rack. "Who are you?" he asked again, the anger draining, leaving only a cold, stark confusion. "My name is Grace Calloway," she said. She wiped her hands, not on her apron. She wore none, but on a rag tucked into her waistband. "I am a widow." He remembered. He had heard talk in town. A wagon train, trapped by the early snows up on the pass. "I was with the party from Missouri," she said, her voice flat, reciting a history she had worn smooth. "We were delayed in Wyoming. We tried to beat the winter. The winter won." He nodded, remembering the talk. Sickness. "My husband, Thomas," she said, her eyes looking at the dough, not at him. "He took the fever. My son, Samuel, he was 6. She paused. He did not ask. He knew the look of someone who had stared into the void. "There was a fire," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "Our wagon. It took everything. The fever took the rest." She looked up, her composure regained. "I have been in town, at the church. Deacon Ferris has been kind, but the town has its own to feed. They cannot shelter a traveler all winter. I was looking for work. I can cook. I can clean. I understand livestock. I can mend clothes. I am not weak." She had walked from town, in this wind, before dawn. "I saw the smoke from your chimney," she said. "I thought perhaps a woman. I came to the barn first. I was just trying to get out of the wind. Then I heard your daughter." He stood there, a triangle of tension. The woman, offering the one thing he had lost, his daughter, pleading for it, and him trapped between the immediate, undeniable warmth of the room and the cold, sharp voices in his head. He heard Mistress Henley's pitying voice, all alone, that poor child. He heard Deacon Ferris's judgment. Solitude can sour a man. Dark paths. What would they say? What would the town think? What would they whisper about on Sunday? If they knew he had a lone woman here, a widower, in his prime, a strange woman. It was a scandal. It was ruin. They would say he was living in sin. They would say he was defiling Mary's memory. They might even, he thought with a jolt of panic, they might even talk about taking Emma. Ferris had mentioned the good of the child. He should say no. The proper thing, the safe thing, was to hitch up his wagon and drive her back to town and hand her over to the deacon. He should protect his name, protect his daughter from the gossip. He looked at Emma. She was shivering, but she would not leave the kitchen. She was watching him, her entire small body vibrating with a desperate hope. "She makes the house happy." It was an answer to her question from the night before. Will the kitchen ever be warm again? He could not throw this woman back into the storm. And he could not, he realized, put out this fire, not yet. He made a decision. It was not a brave one. It was a compromise, a desperate attempt to hold both worlds at bay. He spoke, his voice clipped, transactional. "The hayloft, above the barn, it is dry, and the animals keep it warm. You can stay there." Grace Calloway nodded once. She had expected no less. "That is fair. You will cook for us. You will clean this house. You will earn your keep. That is the arrangement." She met his gaze. "I will earn my keep." He set the boundary, the line of defense against the town, against his own guilt. 2 weeks, he said. 2 weeks, until this storm breaks. Then I will see about the stagecoach, or find you a proper position in town. Just 2 weeks. She nodded again. 2 weeks. The deal was struck, a fragile truce. The kitchen was quiet, but it was a new kind of quiet. It was not the silence of the grave. It was the silence of bread rising. The dough, that pale living mass in the bowl, was a symbol of an impossible second chance. Grace turned back to the stove. She moved with an economy he recognized, the movements of someone who had done this 1,000 times. She slid a large iron sheet, already filled with rounds of dough, into the hot oven. She poured coffee into 2 tin cups. She handed one to him. He took it. The metal was hot against his frozen hands. She turned to Emma. She found a small cup, poured milk from a pail he did not recognize, and added a spoonful of molasses. She must have milked the cow. His cow. She set the cup in front of Emma, who took it with 2 hands. And then Grace pulled the biscuits from the oven. They were not the flat, hard discs he made. They were high, golden, and steam rose from them in a cloud. She broke one open, the inside white and fluffy. She took butter from a small crock and spread it. She handed it to Emma. Emma took it, her eyes never leaving the biscuit. She bit into it, and her eyes closed. A small, involuntary sound of pleasure escaped her. Grace prepared another and held it out to him. Jack stared at it. This was Mary's table. This was Mary's kitchen. And this was not Mary. It felt like a betrayal. A deep, terrible betrayal. But the smell, his stomach, empty and cold, betrayed him first. It growled, a loud, animal sound in the new warmth. Slowly, he reached out his hand. He took the biscuit. He bit into it. The crust was crisp, the inside was soft, and the butter melted on his tongue. It was not just food. It was comfort. It was a truce with life. He ate it in 3 bites. Outside, the first weak light of the gray dawn began to cut through the swirling snow. It was a new day in his life. He had let the world in. He knew, as he drained the last of the hot coffee, that this choice would have a cost. He had lit a fire in his hearth, and now he would have to defend it against the cold judgment of the world outside. The battle had begun. Grace Calloway did not just occupy the house, she flowed into it. She moved with a quiet, relentless energy that found the broken places and mended them. Jack had given her the hayloft, a space of cold privacy, but she entered the house before sunrise and did not leave until long after Emma was asleep. She was a silent engine, and the house began to run. The first thing she did was find Mary's sewing basket, tucked away in a chest, untouched for 2 years. The needle and thread were still there. She sat by the stove in the evenings, the firelight on her face, and she mended the thin muslin curtains that hung in tatters. She darned Jack's socks, her hands moving in a steady, practiced rhythm. She took a rag and a brick of polish to the black iron stove, rubbing until the dusty metal began to shine with a deep, dark luster. She gathered the scattered, disjointed pieces of his household, the lost spoons, the single boots, the chipped plates, and she organized them. She imposed a gentle order on the chaos he had accepted as life. Emma, who had been a small, silent ghost in the corners of the house, attached herself to this new, warm presence. She followed Grace from the pantry to the stove, from the wood box to the kitchen table. She trailed her like a small, curious starling, watching her every move. She did not chatter, not at first. She just watched, her eyes wide, absorbing the simple, domestic magic. One morning, Jack came in from checking the livestock to see Emma sitting on a stool. Grace stood behind her, brushing her hair. Jack's own attempts at braiding were functional, tight knots meant to last the day. Grace's hands were different. They were gentle. "May I?" Grace had asked. Emma had nodded, her head bowed. Grace undid Jack's clumsy work, her fingers moving surely through the tangles. She separated the dark hair into 3 strands. "You see," she said, her voice low, "you just pass one over the other, like weaving a rope, but gentle, always gentle." She wove 2 neat, soft braids that rested on Emma's thin shoulders. Emma reached up, her small fingers touching the braids, as if learning the shape of them. It was a picture of such profound, simple domesticity that it hurt Jack to look at it. It was a practice of family, an echo of a life he had buried. He turned and left the kitchen. The image burned into his mind. This new rhythm held for 3 days. The house was warm. The smell of baking bread or simmering soup was constant. Emma's cough had disappeared. Jack found himself staying in the kitchen in the evenings, ostensibly to clean his tack, but really just to sit in the warmth, to listen to the soft sounds of Emma reading aloud to Grace while she sewed. Then the supplies ran low. The storm had not broken, but it had paused. The wind reduced to a low moan. The town was a necessity. He dreaded it. He felt like a man walking into an ambush. He rode into the settlement, the snow on Main Street packed hard and gray. He tied his horse, his shoulders set against more than the cold. The bell over the general store's door seemed to clang, an alarm announcing his arrival. Mistress Henley was there. He knew she would be. She was not by the counter. She stood near the sacks of flour, as if guarding them. Her smile, when she saw him, was tight and cold. A drawn line on her face. It held no warmth at all. "Mr. Thornton," she said, stepping forward. Her voice was low, conspiratorial. "We have all been so concerned for you." Jack nodded, his face impassive. "Mistress Henley, we are so glad to see your place as stabilized," she went on. "Deacon Ferris and I, we were just discussing the need for community welfare. A child cannot thrive in a cold house." "I need flour and salt," Jack said, turning to the shopkeeper. Mistress Henley moved, placing a hand lightly on his arm, a gesture of false intimacy that made his skin crawl. "But the talk, Mr. Thornton, the talk is that your house is no longer cold at all, that you have taken in company." He froze. He had known this was coming. He had practiced his defense. "She is a widow," he said, his voice flat. "From the wagon train that was stranded, she was destitute." "Oh, a widow," Mistress Henley said, her eyebrows rising in mock sympathy. "How convenient. And a young one. I hear—" "She works for her keep," Jack said, his voice dropping, gaining a hard edge. "It is a Christian duty, an act of charity." The woman's smile thinned until it was just teeth. "A Christian duty, of course. But some acts of charity can look very different to the outside world." She leaned closer. "Mary's grave is not yet 2 years settled on the hill. Mr. Thornton, to bring another woman into your home, perhaps it is the child we should be concerned for." It was a knife, and she had twisted it. The implication was clear. He was a man without morals, sullying his wife's memory, endangering his daughter's soul. He felt a dark, cold rage build in him. He looked at her, his eyes steady, until she, the predator, was the first to look away. "She is not in my home," he said, his voice like chipped stone. "She sleeps in the hayloft. She needed shelter from the storm. I am not a heathen. Mistress Henley, I will not turn a freezing woman away." The shopkeeper, who had been pretending to sort coffee beans, quickly finished sacking the flour. Deacon Ferris watched from his chair by the stove, his face unreadable, his silence a form of judgment. Mistress Henley stepped back, her smile returning, this time victorious. She had drawn blood. In the barn. "How very proper. I am sure the Lord understands your sacrifice completely." Jack paid for his goods, his hands tight. He did not say goodbye. He walked out of the store, the bell mocking him. The words followed him, clinging to him on the ride home, colder than the wind. Mary's grave is not yet settled. He felt the sting of their judgment, the shame they had manufactured for him. He was a good man, but they had painted him as something soiled. The barb was lodged deep in his mind. He rode into the ranch yard, his mood as dark and gray as the sky. He was angry at the town. He was angry at Grace for being there. He was angry at himself for allowing this. He slammed the kitchen door open, ready to release the cold fury, and it vanished. The kitchen was not cold. It was the warmest place in the territory. A rich, thick stew bubbled on the stove, sending steam up to fog the windows. The air was heavy with the scent of beef and onions and herbs. Grace was at the table. Opposite her, on a stool, sat Emma. She was laughing. It was not a loud laugh. It was a small, rusty sound, a piece of machinery that had not been used. She was holding a wooden spoon, and Grace was showing her how to stir a pot of cooled cornmeal mush. Emma's face, usually so pale and solemn, was flushed with warmth and effort. She was alive. The sight of it, the pure, undeniable goodness of it, stopped Jack in his tracks. His anger at the town, his fear of their words, all of it seemed brittle and meaningless compared to this one. Solid fact, his daughter was laughing. He stood there for a long moment, just watching. Grace looked up, her own small smile fading when she saw the look on his face. She knew. They ate supper in a strange quiet. Jack was silent. brooding, his mind replaying the scene in the store. But the stew was hot, thick, and nourishing. It filled his belly and fought back the chill that had settled in his bones. Emma ate. She did not just move food around her plate as she usually did. She ate every bite, her small body soaking up the warmth and the nourishment. She talked, her voice light, telling him about the brown cow's milk, and how Grace said she might have a calf in the spring. It was too much. The warmth, the food, the safety. Her little body, full and content, gave out. Her head began to nod. Her spoon slipped from her fingers. And before Jack could move, she slumped forward, her cheek landing on the clean pine table, fast asleep. The image held them, Jack and Grace, two adults, with a child sleeping peacefully between them at the supper table. It was the very picture of a family. It was the very thing the town was condemning. Grace was the first to speak, her voice barely a whisper. "You went to town." Jack nodded, his jaw tight. "They are talking," she stated. It was not a question. He did not answer, but his silence was enough. Grace folded her hands in her lap. She was a woman of the frontier. Her pride was as real and solid as the mountains. "Mr. Thornton," she said, her eyes on the sleeping child. "I have lost my husband and my son. I have nothing left but my name. I will not have it soiled, and I will not be the cause of shame for you or for this child." She took a breath. "The storm has eased. I can go back to town. I will tell them I'm leaving. Deacon Ferris will find me a place, or I will move on." He looked at her. He saw her strength, her self-respect. She was willing to walk back into the cold, back to the judgment, to protect him. Then he looked at Emma. He saw her face, peaceful in sleep, her belly full, her skin no longer pale and cold. He remembered her words. "She makes the house happy?" He thought of Mistress Henley's cruel, victorious smile. He thought of the cold biscuits, the gray oatmeal, the aching silence that had defined his life. If he sent Grace away, he would be giving the town what it wanted. He would be sacrificing his daughter's happiness to their small, cold rules. He would be putting out the fire. "No," he said. The word was sharp, final. Grace looked up, surprised. "You are not bringing shame. You are earning your keep. You are doing the work I hired you for. The arrangement stands." It was a lie, and they both knew it. It was no longer about an arrangement. It was about the warmth and the laughter and the sleeping child. "But if they talk," she began. "Let them talk," he said, his voice rough. "I do not care what they say." But he did. He cared very much. The seed of doubt, the fear of their power, was planted deep inside him. He was torn. His responsibility as a father, which demanded he keep Emma safe and happy, was now in direct conflict with his fear of the community. That fear was deep, a rancher's practical understanding that he could not survive alone. And beneath that, a new, more terrifying fear. He watched Grace as she gently, carefully, shook Emma awake to help her to bed. He watched the gentle way her hands touched his daughter's shoulder. He felt a stir of something in his own chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the stove. It was admiration. It was gratitude. It was something else. And that feeling, that small, budding emotion, felt like the worst betrayal of all. It felt like proof that Mistress Henley was right. Grace took Emma upstairs. Jack was left alone in the warm kitchen. The smells of stew and bread hung in the air. The fire crackled in the stove. A low, steady heartbeat. He heard the wind picking up outside, whistling under the eaves, reminding him of the world beyond his walls. The line was drawn. It was not just him and Emma against the winter anymore. It was this house, this fragile, three-person island, against the judgment of the town. The bell over the store's door had been a warning. A fight was coming. Jack's 2-week deadline became a bitter joke. The sky, which had been a sullen gray, turned a bruised, venomous purple. Then it tore open. The pause in the weather had been a lie, a predator's trick to draw them out. The real storm, the one the old-timers would talk about for decades, fell upon the valley. It was not just snow. It was a solid, white wall of wind and ice that descended from the mountains, erasing the world. The wind did not howl. It roared, a constant, deafening sound that vibrated in the logs of the house. Within hours, the landscape vanished. The barn was a faint, blurred shape, the cottonwood tree on the rise. Mary's grave disappeared completely. Snow piled in drifts that buried the fences and climbed the walls of the house, sealing the windows on the north side with a thick, opaque plaster of ice. The world shrank to the four walls of the ranch house. And then, as the cold invaded every other room, it shrank further, to the one warm, beating heart, the kitchen. The storm changed the terms. There was no question of Grace leaving, no question of Jack riding to town. The stagecoach was a distant memory from another life. The arrangement was no longer his permission. It was the weather's command. Grace Calloway was no longer a visitor. She was a resident. She was trapped. They all were. The house became a small, wooden ship adrift on a white, violent sea. Their lives, which had been separate, were now forced to braid together, their survival dependent on a shared rhythm. Jack became the man of the outside, a role he understood. His days were brutal. Physical battles against the elements. He fought his way to the barn through drifts that were chest deep, a lifeline of rope strung between the house and the barn door to guide him back in the blinding whiteouts. He fed and watered the stock, their warm, steamy breath and soft sounds a comfort against the storm's fury. He spent hours chopping wood from the massive pile he had stacked, the rhythmic thud of his axe the only sound that could defy the wind. He would return to the house, his coat and beard caked in ice, a human snowman, to dump the wood into the box, his body aching with the cold. Grace was the woman of the inside. She was the firekeeper, the one who fed the stove that was their single source of life. She and Emma were the first to see him when he returned, his eyebrows frozen. Grace would have hot coffee ready, her face calm. She would take his frozen coat and gloves and hang them on the rack, where they would drip and steam. The kitchen became their entire world. They ate every meal there. In the evenings, they did not scatter. The cold in the rest of the house was too deep, too dangerous. They lived within the circle of the stove's heat. A new set of rituals emerged, replacing the old, broken ones. These were the rituals of a functioning family. Breakfast was hot oatmeal with molasses and biscuits. Supper was a thick soup or a rabbit stew. The food was simple, but it was hot, and it was regular. Emma, sealed inside, thrived. The gray, silent shadow of a girl began to fill with color. Grace, it turned out, had a deep, quiet well of patience. She found the dried husks from last year's corn, and with a bit of string and a scrap of calico, she showed Emma how to make a doll. Emma sat at the table for a whole afternoon, her tongue sticking out in concentration, as she learned to fold the husks and tie the waist. She named the doll Mary, not for her mother, but for a character in her primer. Jack sat by the stove, mending a bridle, and watched them. He watched Grace's hands, strong and capable, guiding his daughters. He listened to their low, murmured conversation. He had not heard this in his house for 2 years. It was a healing sound. In the long evenings, the storm's voice was a constant companion. The windows were no longer windows, but panes of frosted glass, so thick with steam from the boiling stew pot that they were opaque. They could not see out. The world could not see in. The kitchen was their own, safe, warm, isolated space. It was on the third night of the blizzard that the stories came. Emma was asleep, bundled in blankets on a pallet Grace had made for her by the stove's hearth. The safest, warmest place in the house. Jack was oiling his boots. Grace was mending one of Emma's thin dresses. The only sounds were the roar of the wind, the crackle of the fire, and the soft rasp of Jack's oil rag on the leather. Grace spoke, her voice quiet, not much louder than the fire. She did not look up from her sewing. Samuel, my son, he would have been 7 this winter. He was a quiet boy, but he loved to listen to the horses. He could tell which horse was coming by its walk. Jack stopped rubbing. He looked at her. Her face was calm, illuminated by the lantern. It was the face of a survivor, one who has stared at their grief so long it has become a familiar landscape. Thomas, my husband, he built wagons, she continued. He was a good man, strong hands. He could fix anything. He always said, there is no such thing as cannot be fixed. Grace, just things we have not found the patience for. She paused, pulling the thread taut. The fever. It took Thomas first. He died in the wagon, in Wyoming. I buried him myself, on the prairie. I had to. Samuel cried. I told him his papa was just resting. We moved on. We had to. Jack watched her, his own guilt a cold stone in his gut. He knew what this cost her to say. Then the fire. She did not say where. It did not matter. It was a cook fire. She said, a spark on the canvas. The wind was high. It went up so fast. I was at the creek, getting water. By the time I ran back. She stopped. Her hands, holding the needle, were perfectly still. I could hear him, she whispered. Just once. Then, just the fire. She did not weep. She had no tears left for this story. She just sat, staring at the small dress in her lap. When I lost my husband, I lost my partner, she said, her voice a dry reed. When I lost my son, I lost the sun. I walked away from that fire with nothing but the clothes I was wearing and the bucket in my hand. I just kept walking. Jack sat, the boot forgotten in his lap. He had no words. He had seen hardship, but this was a hollowing out, a complete erasure. His respect for her, which had been a small, new thing, deepened into a profound, aching understanding. She was not just strong, she was bedrock. He found his own voice, rough and unused. Mary, he said. Grace looked up, her gray eyes meeting his. It was a storm, like this one, but it came on fast. It was her time. The child. He stood up and walked to the steamed window. Wiping a clear circle with his sleeve, he stared out at the black, swirling chaos. I knew it was coming. The baby, our first son. I waited. I thought the storm would pass. I thought I had time. He turned back, his face a mask of old, cold pain. By the time she cried out, it was too late. The snow was too deep. I rode. God, how I rode. I half killed my horse getting to town. The doctor. He would not come. He said it was suicide. He said no man could make it back. He looked at his hands, remembering the frozen rains, the blood on his knuckles. I made it back. I was frozen, but I made it back. But the house, it was too quiet. She was gone. And the baby, he could not finish. He put his hand against the log wall, leaning his weight on it. I killed her, he whispered. If I had gone sooner, if I had not waited, if I had been stronger, faster, I was here. I was the one who was supposed to protect her, and I was in town, fighting with a man while she died alone. He stood there, his back to her, expecting, he did not know what, pity, judgment, silence. He felt her presence behind him, but she did not touch him. Grace's voice was not soft. It was not full of pity. It was as firm and steady as the foundation of the house. You did not call the storm, Mr. Thornton. You did not tell the child to come at that moment. You rode, you made it back. Most men would not have. He shook his head. It was my fault. You are a strong man, she said, but you are not God. You do not command the snow. You do not command death. You fought it. It won. That is not your sin. That is the way of this land. Death comes when it comes. You did not call it. He turned slowly. He looked at her. She was not offering him the soft, useless comfort of Mistress Henley. She was not offering the cold, hard judgment of Deacon Ferris. She was offering him a third thing, the truth. It was a truth without varnish, hard and clean. It did not absolve him of the pain, but it reframed the guilt. It was the first time in 2 years that someone had challenged the narrative he had built in his head. It was the first time someone had told him he was not a murderer. He stared at her, this plain, strong woman who had lost everything and was still standing. She had looked into the fire and walked away. He had looked into the snow and frozen in place. The air in the kitchen was thick with their shared ghosts. The two of them, two solitudes, had finally spoken. They had shown each other their deepest wounds. The wind roared outside, a beast trying to get in. The fire in the stove popped, a small, bright answer. Jack walked back to his chair. He picked up the boot. He picked up the oil rag. He began to rub the leather again, the small, rhythmic sound filling the silence. Grace bent her head and took another stitch. Nothing more was said. Nothing had to be. The windows were completely fogged over, a moist, safe barrier. The kitchen was a forge, and the ice that had been locked around Jack's heart for 2 years had, for the first time, begun to melt. A foundation had been laid. It was not love, not yet. It was something harder, something more essential. It was recognition. The blizzard raged for 4 days, a solid, screaming wall of white, and then on the 5th, it stopped. The silence that fell was as sudden and shocking as a gunshot. The world was remade, buried in a smooth, sparkling shroud of white. The sky a painful, brilliant blue. The air was so cold it felt thin, brittle. The break in the storm was a call to duty. Jack dug his way to the barn, his breath pluming, and began the back-breaking work of clearing paths, checking the drifts that threatened the stable roof, and making sure the cattle had not suffocated or frozen. The sun on the snow was blinding. He was on the roof of the lean-to, shoveling a massive drift, when he saw the rider. It was a single man on a heavy horse, moving slowly through the unbroken snow, following the faint line of the creek. Jack's hand went to the axe in his belt. He watched, his body tense. No neighbor would be out for a social call. This was something else. As the rider drew closer, Jack recognized the square, solid shape of Deacon Ferris. He climbed down from the roof, landing solidly in the snow. He stood by the barn door, waiting. His face was hard, set against the cold and the intrusion. Deacon Ferris pulled his horse to a stop. His face was red with the cold, his beard frosted. He looked at Jack, his eyes sweeping over the ranch yard, noting the cleared path to the house, the thin, steady plume of smoke from the chimney. "Mr. Thornton," the deacon called out, his voice uncertain. He did not dismount. "Deacon," Jack said, not moving. "It is a hard day to be riding." Ferris nodded grimly. "The Lord's work is not confined to mild weather. I am checking on the families of my flock, the outliers. We were concerned." Jack's jaw tightened. "We, the town, Mistress Henley." "We are managing," Jack said, the same words he had used in the store. The deacon's gaze shifted to the house. The kitchen window was opaque with steam, a sign of the warmth within. "It seems you are managing well. The reports of your domestic arrangement were not exaggerated." "It is an arrangement of necessity," Jack said, his voice flat. The woman was stranded. "A necessity," Ferris repeated, tasting the word. He looked back at Jack, his eyes small and sharp. "Some necessities can become a comfort, Mr. Thornton, and comforts can become a snare for the soul." "What is your meaning?" Deacon, my meaning is for the child, he said, his voice taking on the righteous tone of the pulpit. An 8-year-old girl, innocent, impressionable, to be raised in a house with a stranger, a woman who is not kin, not bound by marriage. It creates a situation that is morally ambiguous. Morally ambiguous? Jack repeated, the words like ash in his mouth. She is cooking and cleaning. She is keeping my daughter warm. There is no ambiguity in that. The child's spiritual welfare is the concern of this community, Ferris said, his voice hardening. She needs a proper example. I am here to advise you as your spiritual leader. Send the woman away. Send her to town. We will find a place for her at the church. With the other charity cases, it is the only proper solution. For the sake of the girl. Jack stared at him. The man had ridden 5 miles through unbroken drifts, in sub-zero weather, not to bring food, not to offer help with the cattle, but to deliver a moral ultimatum. And if I do not? Jack asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Ferris gathered his reins, his gaze cold. The community has options. Mr. Thornton, the law has options, when the welfare of a child is at stake. It was a threat, clear and cold as the air they were breathing. A threat to take Emma. Ferris turned his horse. I will pray for you. I will pray that you see the light and correct this course before true harm is done. He rode away, his heavy horse churning through the deep snow. Jack watched him go, a black, slow-burning rage building inside him. He was a man who prized his independence, and this was an invasion, a violation of his home. He turned and looked at the house. He was protecting the warmth inside, and they were calling it a sin. That night, the cold deepened. The clear sky sucked every last bit of warmth from the land. The temperature plummeted to a place where metals snapped and the trees groaned, their trunks splitting in the freeze. Jack was checking the latches on the stable door when he heard it. A high, thin cry, followed by a chorus of yips and howls. Wolves. They were close, drawn by the scent of the cattle, their hunger made desperate by the storm. He ran back to the house. Grace was at the door before he reached it, her face pale in the lantern light. Wolves, he said, grabbing his rifle from the pegs above the door. Stay inside. Bar the door. He fumbled for the box of cartridges. Grace did not move. They are at the lean-to, she said, her voice steady. Here. She pointed to a spot on the wall. They are trying for the new calf. How do you know? I can hear the mother. She is afraid. Grace grabbed the other lantern, the one they kept by the stove. She lit it, her hand not shaking. I am coming. Jack turned on her, his voice harsh. You are not. It is not safe. She met his gaze, the lantern held high. They are not afraid of a gun they cannot see, but they are afraid of fire. 2 lights are better than 1. They will think we are more than we are. He stared at her. She was right. He had been a fool, running out with just a gun. She was thinking, not reacting. He gave a short, sharp nod. Stay behind me. He unbarred the door and stepped out into the night. The cold was a physical blow, a solid wall that stole his breath. The sky was filled with a million brilliant, indifferent stars. The howling was louder now, a frantic, hungry sound from near the stable. He moved forward, the rifle ready. Grace was 2 steps behind him, as she had been told, holding the second lantern high. Its yellow light cut a small, brave circle in the vast, frozen darkness. He saw them, a pack of 5, gray, ghostly shapes, circling the small lean-to where he kept the new calf and its mother. Their eyes flashed green in the light. Jack raised his rifle, but they were shadows, moving too fast. Grace stepped out from behind him, holding her lantern forward. Go! She yelled, her voice sharp and strong. Not a scream, but a command. Hiya, go on. She took a step toward them, the light swinging. The wolves, startled by the second light and the sudden, confident voice, fell back a few paces, their ears flat. Jack fired. The shot cracked the frozen silence, echoing off the mountains. He did not aim to hit, but to scare. The bullet kicked up snow just short of the pack leader. The combination of the shot, the two bobbing lanterns, and Grace's steady, advancing presence was too much for them. The pack leader turned, and in an instant, the ghostly shapes vanished back into the darkness. The silence that fell was absolute. Jack stood, the rifle smoking, his heart pounding. He turned to Grace. She was standing still, the lantern held high. Her face was set, her eyes still scanning the darkness. This was not a weak woman. This was not a charity case. This was a woman who had faced fire and fever. And now this. He had seen her strength in the kitchen. Now he had seen it in the face of the wild. It was a frontier strong that matched his own. A deep, profound respect, warmer than any fire, settled in his chest. She is not weak, he thought, with a sense of revelation. She is a partner. They went back inside, the cold chasing them. They barred the door, the small kitchen seeming like a fortress. "Grace," he said, his voice rough with the cold. That was good." She just nodded, her face still pale. She hung up the lantern. "They were hungry. They will be back." He nodded. "I will sit up." She looked at him. "We will sit up." And so they did. They sat at the kitchen table, the rifle between them, drinking coffee and listening. It was an hour later that Emma coughed. It was not her usual small cough. It was a dry, hacking sound that ripped the quiet. Grace was on her feet before the second cough came. Jack was right behind her. They reached her pallet by the stove. Emma was stirring. Her face flushed a dark, unnatural red in the firelight. Her skin, when Grace touched her forehead, was burning. "Fever," Grace whispered. The word dropped into the room like a stone. Jack's blood ran cold. He was back in that other night, in the blizzard, listening to Mary's breathing grow shallow. He felt the old, paralyzing terror rise up, choking him. Grace looked at him, and she saw it. Her own face was pale, her eyes wide with the ghosts of her own loss. He could see her, poised on the edge of that same abyss, the memory of her own son, Samuel. They stared at each other for a long second. Two survivors, each seeing their worst nightmare in the other's eyes. Then Grace's face hardened. She broke the spell. She did not panic. She acted. "We do not run," she said, as much to herself as to him. "We fight." Her voice galvanized him. He was not alone this time. "Water," she commanded. "A pot to boil, and clean rags." He moved, his paralysis broken by her purpose. He stoked the fire, adding wood until it roared. Heating the kettle, he brought the rags. Grace, meanwhile, had gone to the small pantry. She came back, not with food, but with a small tin she had brought in from her satchel in the barn. She opened it. Inside were dried herbs and strips of bark. "Willow," she said, dropping a handful of bark into a cup. "For the fever. My mother taught me." She gently lifted Emma's head, cradling her. Emma moaned, her eyes half open, but she did not seem to see them. Jack watched as Grace coaxed the bitter tea into his daughter. She tore the rags into strips, dipped them in cool water, and bathed Emma's face, her neck, her thin arms. She was not just tending to a child. She was at war. They fell into a rhythm. Grace was the general, her hands and voice gentle but firm. Jack was the soldier, the supplier. He kept the fire blazing. He brought fresh, cool water from the bucket. He sat, helpless, holding his daughter's hand while Grace worked. He prayed, clumsy, silent prayers of a man who had forgotten how. The hours dragged. The fever did not break. Emma's breathing became shallow, rapid. She began to murmur, lost in a world he could not reach. Jack's fear solidified into a cold, hard knot. He saw the pattern repeating, the storm, the sickness, the woman he cared for, fading. Grace never stopped. She hummed, a low, tuneless, wordless sound, the same sound she used to soothe the cattle. She wiped, she soothed, she spoke to Emma in a low, constant murmur. Sometime, in the deepest part of the night, Jack looked at Grace. Her face was gray with exhaustion. Her eyes were hollow, dark with the memory of the son she had lost. He realized what this was costing her. She was reliving the worst night of her life, moment by moment. But she did not stop. She was fighting for his child as if she were her own. The line between gratitude and something deeper blurred, and then vanished. The sky was just beginning to turn from black to a bruised gray when Emma's breathing changed. It deepened. The rapid, shallow pants slowed. A small, faint sheen of sweat broke out on her forehead. Grace put her hand flat on the girl's brow. She held it there for a long time. She looked up at Jack, her eyes filled with a weariness so profound it was almost black. But there was a spark, a pinprick of light. "It is breaking," she whispered. "The fever is breaking." Jack's legs gave out. He did not fall, but he sagged against the wall, the tension draining out of him in a rush, leaving him weak. Grace did not move. She continued to bathe Emma's face, her movements slow, almost trance-like. "Jack, go," she whispered. "See to the stock. The sun is up." He did not want to leave, but he knew she was right. Life had to go on. He nodded, unable to speak. He forced his aching body into his frozen coat and went out into the brutal, beautiful dawn. The world was pink and gold. He did not see it. He worked for an hour, his movements automatic. He fed the cattle. He broke the ice in their trough. He checked for wolf tracks. There were none. When he returned, the kitchen was quiet. The sun was streaming in the east window. The first time in days. The steam on the glass was beginning to melt, clear patches forming where the light struck. He stopped at the door. Grace was slumped in the chair by the pallet. Her head was bowed, resting on the edge of Emma's small bed. She was asleep, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. But her hand, even in sleep, was still stretched out, her fingers laced through Emma's, a lifeline. Jack stood there, his heart so full it ached. He looked at the woman who had faced down the town, the wolves, and now death. She had fought for his daughter, and she had won. The wave of feeling that washed over him was so powerful it staggered him. It was not just respect, it was not just gratitude, it was love. A quiet, fierce, and undeniable love for this strong, broken, and beautiful woman. He did not wake her. He moved to the stove, his motions as quiet as possible. He made coffee. She woke an hour later, with a small, startled gasp, her head snapping up. "It is all right," Jack said, his voice low. "She is sleeping. The fever is gone." Grace looked at Emma, touched her forehead, and let out a long, shuddering breath of relief. She tried to stand, but staggered. Jack was there. He put out a hand, steadying her. "Sit," he said. He poured her a cup of hot coffee and handed it to her. She took it, her hands shaking. Their eyes met over the rims of their cups. The kitchen was filled with the smell of coffee and the clean, new sunlight. "Grace," he said, his voice rough. She looked at him, waiting. He did not have the words. He did not know how to say what was in his heart. It was too new, too big, and it felt still, like a betrayal. So he did the only thing he could. He set his cup down. He reached out and gently, hesitantly, he took her hand. Her hand was rough, chapped from lye soap and cold water. But it was warm. She looked at their joined hands, then up at him, her eyes wide, questioning. He just held it. He did not stroke it, did not squeeze it. He just held it, a silent, solemn, and complete acknowledgement. He held it for a long, long time, the two of them sitting in the morning sun, while his daughter slept peacefully. The breath on the window pane, which had hidden them from the world, was melting away, letting the world in, and letting him see the future. Later that afternoon, when Emma was awake, sitting up and asking for broth, Jack put on his coat. Grace looked at him, a question in her eyes. "I will be back," he said. He walked out of the house, his stride purposeful. He walked past the barn, past the frozen creek, up the rise to the solitary cottonwood tree. The snow was deep, but he knew the spot. He stood before the simple wooden cross, his hat in his hands, the cold wind touching his face. "Mary," he said, his voice quiet. He stood there for a long time. He told her about the cold, and the silence, and the fear. He told her about Emma, and how she had forgotten how to laugh. And then he told her about Grace, about the bread, and the fire, and the wolves. He told her how she had fought for Emma, how she had brought the light back. I am not forgetting you," he whispered to the frozen earth. "I will never, but I think I have to live. Emma has to live." He stood there, waiting. The only answer was the sigh of the wind through the bare branches. It felt, for the first time, not like an accusation, but like a release. He went back to the house. Grace was at the window, watching for him. He walked over to her. "Grace, put your coat on. There is someone I want you to meet." He led her out of the house, up the same path, to the top of the rise. He led her to the grave. They stood there, side by side, looking at the wooden cross. "Grace Calloway," Jack said, his voice clear and formal, as if in church. "This is Mary, my wife." Grace did not speak. She simply nodded. She reached out one hand, her glove off, and gently brushed the snow from the top of the wooden marker. It was a gesture of respect, woman to woman. An introduction, the past and the present, standing side by side under the cold, blue sky. He did not sleep. He sat in the hard wooden chair by the newly roaring fire, the rifle across his knees. He was a man waiting for the dawn, a man preparing for a war. He was guarding his home, but more, he was guarding his resolve. He knew what he had to do. It was not enough to defy the town in private. He had to break their power in public. Before the first light, he moved. He went to Emma, who had fallen asleep on her pallet. He gently shook her shoulder. "Get your coat," he said, his voice low but firm. "We are going." She did not question him. She just nodded, her eyes wide, her faith in him restored. He strode to the barn, the icy rain having turned to a thick, cold mist. He did not saddle his horse. He hitched the wagon team. His hands were quick, sure, his movements economical and angry. He was not a man running from a fight. He was a man driving to one. He helped Emma onto the wagon bench, wrapping her in every blanket they owned. He took the reins. He drove the team hard, faster than was safe on the frozen, muddy ruts. The wagon slid and groaned, but he did not slow down. He had to beat the stage. Main Street was a river of gray mud in the half-light. The air smelled of wet wood and cold animals. The stagecoach was there, a large, dark shape, its horses stamping and steaming in the cold. A few people were clustered, waiting to see the coach off, and standing under the wooden awning of the post office, as if to make sure their judgment was carried out, stood Deacon Ferris and Mistress Henley. They were not traveling. They were there to watch their victory. And Grace was there. She was not with the others. She stood alone, a little apart, her single, worn valise at her feet. She was wearing her only coat, her bonnet tied neatly. Her face was calm, pale, but composed. She was not weeping. She was not a victim. She was a picture of profound, quiet self-respect. A woman facing her banishment with a strength that shamed the men who had judged her. Jack pulled the wagon team to a halt, The horses stomped and snorted, and the wagon wheels slid on the ice-slicked mud. He jumped down from the bench. He looked at Emma. "Stay here," he commanded. He strode past the front of his team, his boots sinking deep into the cold mud. He did not look at Ferris. He did not look at the crowd. He walked straight to Grace. The stage driver called out, "Time to board, ma'am." Grace put her hand on the handle of her valise. Jack put his hand over hers. Her hand was ice cold, but it did not tremble. He said, his voice clear and loud, so everyone could hear, "Do not get on the coach." Grace looked up at him, her eyes wide with a sudden, painful, confused hope. He did not look at her. He kept his hand on hers, a warm, living anchor. And he turned. He faced the town. He faced the deacon. He was no longer the defendant from the church basement. He was Jack Thornton, of the Thornton Ranch. And he was on his own ground. "You are all here," he called out, his voice ringing in the cold air. "You came to see me correct my situation. You came to see me send this woman away." Deacon Ferris stepped forward, his face darkening with anger. "Mr. Thornton, this is not the place for a private matter." Jack cut him off, his voice like a whip. "You made it a public matter when you summoned me. You made it a public matter when you threatened to take my child." A gasp went through the small crowd. They had not known that part. The whispers stopped. "You judged me in a dark room, Deacon," Jack continued, his voice resonant. "I will give my answer here, in the light." He took his hand from Grace's and took a step forward, putting himself between her and the town. He was a shield. "You want to judge this woman," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "Then you judge me." He pointed a finger at Ferris, then at Mistress Henley. "You sat in your righteousness, and you called her a scandal. You, Mistress Henley, you twisted my one attempt at propriety into something filthy. You, Deacon, you used my daughter as a weapon. You told me to choose." The crowd was silent, shocked. This was not the quiet, broken widower they knew. 2 years, Jack shouted, his voice cracking with a pain that was 2 years old. "My house was a tomb. My daughter was a ghost, walking in a cold house, and all of you, you whispered, you worried, you pitied, but you did nothing." He turned and pointed to Grace, his arm outstretched. "Then she came, a woman who had lost everything, her husband, her son. She came to my cold house, and she lit the fire. She baked bread. She mended my daughter's clothes. She taught my child how to laugh again." He paused, his gaze sweeping the faces. He saw doubt. He saw shame. When the fever came, the same fever that stole her own boy, she did not run. She stayed. She fought. She brought my daughter back from the edge. When the wolves came, she did not hide. She stood beside me with a lantern. She has more courage, more true Christian charity in her than this whole council." He took a deep, ragged breath and delivered his final, terrible judgment. "She saved my child. She brought the light back into my home. If being grateful for that is a sin, I am a sinner. If loving this woman is a scandal, then your God and my God are two different beings." The silence that followed was absolute, heavy as wet snow. Mistress Henley was the first to break, her voice a high, thin screech. "It is a disgrace. He defiles the memory of his sainted wife, Mary." Before Jack could answer, another voice spoke, a deep, slow, and powerful voice. "That is enough, Martha." Tom Wheeler stepped out from the crowd. He was a big man, a rancher from the north, a man who spoke little but whose words carried the weight of iron. He walked past Deacon Ferris and stood near Jack, not beside him, but in support. He looked at the deacon. "Ferris, I have known Jack Thornton for 10 years. He is a good man. He buried his wife, and he has raised that girl alone, and none of us helped him. This woman, she did. I will not stand by and hear you call that a scandal. I think you should leave this man and his family be." A murmur started. A woman at the back called out, She helped my boy with his cough. She asked for nothing." Another man nodded. The power of the council, so absolute in the dark, was dissolving in the light. Mistress Henley, her face a mask of pure fury, saw the tide had turned. She had lost. She spun on her heel and marched into the general store, slamming the door behind her. Deacon Ferris was left standing alone, his face dark, his authority shattered. He looked at Jack, then at Tom Wheeler. He said nothing. He, too, turned and walked away. The crowd, their drama over, began to break apart, talking in low voices, shuffling away. The stage driver, who had watched the entire proceeding with interest, spat a stream of tobacco. "Well, I have a schedule to keep," he yelled at the passengers, and the big coach groaned and lurched forward, its wheels churning in the mud. It pulled away, rumbling down the street, leaving. It was leaving the past behind. Jack stood, his body shaking from the adrenaline. He was alone in the street with Grace. He turned to her. The calm, composed mask was gone. Her face was undone. She was looking at him as if seeing him for the first time. Tears were streaming, unchecked, down her cheeks. He stepped to her. "I am a fool. Grace," he said, his voice low. "Just for her, I was a coward, but I am done being one." He reached out and took her hand. Her bare hand was still so cold. He laced his fingers through hers, a firm, solid promise, a joining. She did not pull away. She gripped his hand, her whole body shaking. He stepped closer, into her space. He looked down at her, and his heart felt too large for his chest. He gently, so gently, rested his forehead against hers. It was a public act of private devotion. They stood like that for a long, silent moment, breathing the same cold air, a quiet, unspoken proposal understood by anyone who was left to see. It was a vow. A high, thin cry shattered the moment. "Papa, Grace." They broke apart. Emma. She could not stay in the wagon a second longer. She had scrambled down, her blankets falling away. She ran, her small boots splashing through the mud. She did not run to her father. She launched herself at Grace, her arms wrapping around her waist in a desperate, clinging hug. "You stayed. You stayed." Grace, startled, let out a choked sob. Her first sound. She looked down at the child, then up at Jack, her eyes streaming. Her hands, which had been trembling, came up and settled on Emma's back, holding her, locking her in place. Jack stepped forward. He put his one arm around his daughter, and his other arm around the woman he loved. He pulled them both close to him, into his coat, into his protection. The three of them stood there, in the middle of Main Street, a triangle, a fortress, a family. Grace looked up at Jack, her face buried against his shoulder. Emma held tight between them. She was not temporary. She was not a visitor. She was home. The ride home was a new kind of quiet. It was not the strained silence of unspoken grief, nor the heavy silence of coming conflict. It was the quiet of a battle finished, the stunned, vibrating air after the final shot has been fired. Emma sat between them on the wagon bench. She did not say a word, but her small body was a spring of taut, vibrating joy. She held Grace's hand, her fingers laced tight, as if she was afraid the woman might dissolve into the morning mist. Jack drove the team, his gaze fixed on the muddy ruts ahead. He felt hollowed out, exhausted, but also, for the first time in 2 years, light. He had faced the town, and he had not broken. He had stood his ground, and the ground had held. As they passed the edge of the settlement, they saw a few faces. Some, friends of Deacon Ferris or Mistress Henley, stared with cold disapproval before turning their backs. They were shadows, their power gone, but their judgment remained. Then they passed Tom Wheeler, who was checking a fence line. He did not stop his work, but as the wagon drew level, he looked up. He met Jack's eye, and he gave a single, slow nod. It was a gesture of respect, man to man. It was the closing of a protective circle. Jack knew then that while the whispers might continue, the war was over. The ranchers, the men of substance, would stand with him. They arrived at the ranch. The kitchen was cold, the fire from the night before long dead. Emma ran inside, but Jack and Grace paused by the wagon. Grace looked toward the barn, her expression uncertain. Her valise was still in the back of the wagon. "I should retrieve my things," she said, her voice quiet. Jack shook his head. He reached into the wagon bed and lifted the small, worn valise. It was light, holding the few remnants of her past life. He did not hand it to her. He walked to the kitchen door and stepped inside, placing the valise firmly on the floor by the table. He turned to her. "Grace, the hayloft! It is too cold, and it is not right." She watched him, her heart in her throat, not daring to understand. "There is a room," he said, his voice rough, looking at the floor. "The spare room, next to Emma's. It is small, but it is warm." It was more than a room. It was an invitation. It was the final, practical, and undeniable offer of a place, not as a hired hand, not as a charity case, but as part of the house. Tears, which she had not shed in the street, now pricked her eyes. She simply nodded, unable to speak. "I will take this up," he said, grabbing the valise. He was a man of action, not words, and the simple, domestic act was his true confession. He carried her bag up the stairs, the sound of his boots firm and steady on the wooden steps. He was placing her inside his home. That evening, the atmosphere was transformed. The fear that had haunted the house was gone. In its place was a quiet, almost shy, sense of newness. Grace cooked, but she was not cooking for her keep. She was cooking for her family. Jack came in from the barn, his chores done. He washed his hands at the dry sink, the scent of lye soap and clean water filling the air. "Emma," Grace said, "it is time to set the table." Jack watched. This was a ritual that had become theirs in the past weeks. But tonight, it was different. Emma, with a look of grave, sacred importance, took out 3 plates. She set one at the head of the table, on Jack's left. That was his place. She set one on the right side of the table. That was hers. Then she paused. She took the 3rd plate and, with deliberate care, placed it at the foot of the table, facing Jack. It was a position of equal, opposite partnership. It was Grace's place. She then set out the forks, the knives, the tin cups, 3 places, a triangle, complete and strong. Grace saw it. She looked at the plate, then at Emma, then at Jack. Jack met her gaze and gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. It was done. They sat, the 3 of them, Jack at the head, Grace at the foot, Emma between them. It was a supper of thanks, but also a quiet, unspoken ceremony of belonging. The family, which had been a temporary arrangement, was now formalized, its lines drawn by the simple, certain hands of a child. Life settled. The following Sunday, Jack hitched the wagon. He did not ask. He stated, "We are going to town for the church service." Grace paused, her hand on her bonnet. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of doubt. She saw none. He was not asking her to hide. He was asking her to stand with him. They walked into the small white church as a unit, Jack first, tall and resolute, Grace beside him, her head held high. Emma held both their hands. A wave of whispers rippled through the pews. Jack ignored them. He led Grace and Emma to the Thornton family pew, the one his father had helped build. He sat. Grace sat beside him. Emma sat between them, a small, proud barrier against the world. Tom Wheeler was there, with his wife. The woman smiled, a warm, genuine expression, and nodded at Grace. The protective circle held. Deacon Ferris climbed the pulpit. His face was gray, his authority visibly diminished. He did not look at the Thornton pew. His sermon, which was usually a fiery condemnation of the world's sins, was a dry, academic talk about ancient parables. The fire was gone. He had lost his flock's support on the one issue that mattered, and his power, which was built on the hollow foundation of public shame, had crumbled. Mistress Henley was not there at all. Winter, however, was not yet finished. It had been beaten back, but it held one last cruel card. A week after their visit to the church, the thaw reversed. A final, bitter cold snap descended from the north, plunging the valley back into a deep freeze. It was not a blizzard, but a quiet, killing cold. Jack woke in the middle of the night. The house was silent, but some instinct pulled him from sleep. A sound, or the lack of it. He looked out the window. The stars were brilliant, hard chips of ice in a black sky. It was the coldest night of the year. Then he heard it, a low, distressed bawling from the barn. He was out of bed, pulling on his boots and heavy coat in seconds. He grabbed his lantern and ran. He found the brown cow, Emma's favorite, in a stall, frantic. She had calved, too early, and the baby was in the straw, small and terribly still. It was a pale, weak thing, already stiffening. Jack cursed, his breath smoking. He scooped the calf up. It was limp, its breathing a shallow, faint rattle. He began to rub it, his hands rough and desperate, trying to force life back into the frozen limbs. The barn door opened, casting a second lantern's light into the stall. Grace stood there, her hair down, wearing his own heavy wool coat over her nightgown. "I heard the cow," she said. She saw the tiny, limp form in his arms, her face, illuminated from below by the lantern, set into the same lines of fierce, determined battle he had seen when Emma had the fever. "Give it to me," she said. Jack hesitated. "Grace, it is too late. It is barely breathing." She looked at him, her eyes flashing in the light. "We do not run. Jack, we fight. Bring it to the house, now." The echo of that other night, the night she had saved his daughter, galvanized him. He nodded. He carried the calf, Grace holding the lantern to light the icy path. They burst into the kitchen. Emma, woken by the noise, sat up on her pallet, her eyes wide with fear. They laid the calf on the warm hearth, on the very blankets where Emma had fought her own fever. It was a repetition, a ritual. Grace boiled milk, adding a spoonful of molasses for strength. Jack found the roughest burlap sacks he had and began to rub the calf, his movements hard, trying to spark the blood. "Get it warm," Grace commanded, her voice low and steady. They worked as a team, two partners in a familiar war against the cold, against death. Grace gently forced the calf's mouth open, letting a few drops of the warm, sweet milk fall onto its tongue. Jack rubbed until his arms ached. Emma, silent, watched from her bed. For an hour, they fought. The calf seemed gone. Then its ear flickered. It let out a small, shuddering sigh. Its legs, which had been rigid, gave a weak kick. "It is alive," Grace whispered, her voice full of a fierce, strained hope. She dipped her finger in the milk and pushed it into the calf's mouth. The calf, instinctively, began to suck. A weak, bleeding cry filled the kitchen. It was going to live. They sat back on their heels, exhausted, triumphant, covered in straw and milk. They had done it. They had held back the winter one more time. As the first gray light of dawn filled the kitchen, Jack stood. "Let us get him back to his mother," he said, his voice thick. He wrapped the now wriggling, complaining calf in a blanket. Grace held the lantern. They walked back to the barn together. They presented the calf to the frantic mother. The cow bawled, a low, relieved sound, and immediately began licking her baby, cleaning it, urging it to stand. Jack and Grace leaned against the side of the stall, watching. The barn was quiet, filled with the sweet, warm smell of hay and animals. The single lantern, still burning, hung from a hook, swaying slightly, sending their shadows dancing on the wooden wall. They were long, tall shadows, and as the lantern swung, they moved, blending and separating, becoming one, then two, then one again. Jack turned to her. Her face, in the soft light, was weary, but beautiful. He was overwhelmed by a feeling of profound, complete partnership. This was the woman who had stood with him, against the town, against the wolves, against the fever, against the cold. "Grace," he said. He did not have the words. He never had the words. He reached out, his hand rough from the burlap, and touched her cheek. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief second. He stepped closer and pulled her to him. It was not a tentative embrace. It was a hug of pure, unfiltered relief and gratitude. He held her tight, his face buried in her hair, breathing in the scent of her, and of the hay, and of the new morning. She held him back, her arms wrapping around his waist, holding on just as tightly. He pulled back, just enough to see her face. He looked at her, and she looked back at him, her gray eyes clear, holding nothing back. He lowered his head and kissed her. It was not a kiss of desperate passion. It was a kiss of arrival. It was warm and solid and mature. It was respectful. It was a promise, made in the quiet of the morning, witnessed only by the animals. He pulled away, but kept his hands on her arms. He started, his voice rough. "I still think of Mary, every day." Grace's expression did not falter. She nodded. "You should," she said, her voice soft. "She was your wife. She is Emma's mother. She is woven into this place." "But this," he said, struggling. It feels." She placed her hand over his heart, a simple, steady gesture. "Jack," she said, her voice the sanest, kindest sound he had ever heard. "Love does not erase love. It does not replace it. It builds another room. The heart is a big house." He looked at her, the simple, powerful truth of her words washing over him, healing the last of the old, cold guilt. She was not a replacement. She was an addition. He smiled, a true, real smile, one that reached his eyes. He took her hand. They stood for a long moment, watching the new calf finally, shakily, get to its feet. They walked out of the barn, hand in hand. The air that met them was different. The biting cold was gone. The wind had shifted. It was a Chinook, a warm, soft wind blowing down from the mountains. And with it came a sound, the sound of dripping water, the sound of icicles, melting, the sound of snow, sliding from the roof. The winter had finally, truly, broken. Jack looked up at the mountains, the peaks emerging from the morning mist. "The pass will be open soon," he said. The words were a statement, but also a test. The world was opening up. Grace looked at the mountains, then back at the house, where a new plume of smoke was rising from the chimney. Emma was up, rebuilding the fire. "It does not matter," Grace said, squeezing his hand. "I have no reason to go." The Chinook wind was a promise kept. It blew for 3 days, a warm, soft breath that scoured the last of the ice from the trees and sent the great drifts of snow into a full retreat. The sound of the ranch was no longer the shriek of wind, but the constant, gentle sound of dripping water. The world, which had been a stark, blinding white, was now a deep, rich, muddy brown. The earth was emerging, wet and fertile, smelling of damp soil and new life. Spring in the high country did not arrive. It was a muddy, chaotic brawl, and it was the most beautiful thing Jack Thornton had ever seen. The first day, the ground was truly free of frost. Grace stood by the kitchen window, looking out at a patch of weed-choked ground near the house. It was fenced with old, rotting wood. "That was Mary's garden," Jack said from the table, his voice quiet. Grace nodded, her gaze taking in the space. "A garden wants to be worked," she said almost to herself. "It does not like to be idle." Jack watched her. He felt the old, familiar pang, the shadow of betrayal. But it was a weak thing now, a ghost with no power. He thought of her words in the barn. "It builds another room." He stood up, pushing his chair back. "The soil is good there. It gets the morning sun." He went to the barn. He returned not with his rifle, but with the heavy plow hoe and a shovel. He walked to the garden patch and, with a grunt, sank the hoe's blade into the thick, wet sod. He was breaking new ground, in every sense. They worked all afternoon, the three of them. Jack's strength was for the heavy work, turning the resistant earth, pulling the stubborn roots. Grace, with a farmer's knowledge he had not known she possessed, broke the clods, her hands sifting the soil, testing its texture. And Emma was the center. She was a small, joyful mess, her dress and face smeared with mud. She followed in her father's wake, pulling at the smaller weeds, her face a mask of serious concentration. She found a long, pale earthworm, and her shriek of delight was a sound that made Jack's heart ache with a new, unfamiliar joy. She chased him with it, her laughter, no longer rusty, but a full, bright peal that carried on the warm air. They were not just planting, they were replanting. Grace had a small tin of seeds, salvaged from her wagon, beans, carrots, and potatoes Jack had saved in the root cellar. They were planting things that would last, things to feed a family. They were planting a future, their hands all in the same dirt. A week later, Jack took his usual walk. The sun was warm on his back. He went up the rise, his boots pressing into the new, soft grass. He walked to the cottonwood tree, his hat in his hands. He stopped, his breath catching. The grave was no longer a patch of bare, sad earth. Pushing up through the soil, ringing the simple wooden cross, were green, determined shoots, small, tight buds of purple and yellow. He stared, confused. These were not wild. He walked back to the house, his mind working. He found Grace on the porch, mending a pair of Emma's trousers. "The flowers," he said, his voice rough. "On the hill." Grace did not look up, but a small, quiet smile touched her mouth. "I had some bulbs, in my tin, from my home in Missouri. I planted them, that day you first showed me." He was silent, trying to understand the depth of the gesture. "They are perennials," she said softly. "They are strong. They come back year after year. Even if you forget about them, they hold the ground." He looked at her, bent over her sewing, this woman who had so little, and yet who gave life wherever she went. She had not just tended his child, she was tending his past. She had taken his shrine of grief and turned it into a garden, a living memorial. She was teaching him that remembrance was not a duty of sorrow, but a habit of love. Their lives, which had been defined by the high, sharp drama of survival, now settled into the low, steady rhythm of living. Their courtship was a quiet, adult thing. It had no need for grand pronouncements. It was built in the small, daily moments. Jack, clumsy with this new, gentle language, would come in from the fields and place a tin cup of wildflowers on the table, purple shooting stars and yellow bells. He would not say they were for her. He would just clear his throat and announce, "The creek is high." And Grace would smile and find a place for them by the window. In the evenings, after Emma was asleep, they sat on the porch. Jack had mended the old swing, and the soft, rhythmic creak of it was a new sound for the ranch. They sat, not always talking, just breathing in the cooling air, listening to the first crickets of the new season. They did not speak of love. They spoke of life. "Emma is bright," Grace said one evening, her voice thoughtful. "She needs more than her primer." Jack nodded, watching the last light fade from the mountains. "I was thinking, the town. It needs a real school. Tom Wheeler and we were talking about it. Pooling funds. And," Grace added, her hands busy with a spool of thread, "the herd is strong. That new calf is as solid as a rock." "We could use a new bull," Jack mused, thinking aloud. "If we are to build—" This was their romance. It was the talk of schoolhouses and breeding stock and the future of the ranch. It was the careful, steady weaving of two lives into one. The next trip to town was not a battle. It was an arrival. Jack pulled the wagon up to the general store. He climbed down, then turned and, in the full light of day, lifted his hands to Grace. She took them, and he helped her down from the bench. He did not release her hand immediately. He held it for a beat, a small, public declaration. They walked in. The bell chimed. Mistress Henley was at the counter. She saw them. She saw Jack, solid and sure. She saw Grace, standing beside him, not behind him. She saw Emma, holding Grace's other hand. The woman's face, which had been a weapon of false pity, turned to stone. She pursed her lips, sniffed, and turned her back. Becoming intensely interested in a bolt of calico, she did not speak. Deacon Ferris was across the street. He saw them. He gave a single, curt nod, the nod of a man acknowledging a fact he cannot change, and disappeared into the post office. Their cold silence was a concession of defeat. But then, Mistress Wheeler, Tom's wife, a large woman with a kind face, bustled over. "Mistress Calloway," she said, her voice warm, ignoring Mistress Henley completely. "I heard you saved the Thornton calf in that last freeze. We lost two. It was a terrible cold. You must have a knack." "I was just glad to help," Grace said, her voice quiet but steady. "Well, you are both coming to the barn raising next month," Mistress Wheeler said. It was not a question. It was a command. "We need good cooks and strong arms." She smiled at Jack. The community, the one that mattered, was not just accepting them. It was embracing them. The town, like the land, was finding its new shape after the storm. Emma, too, was changing. The small, gray ghost was gone forever. In her place was a girl, vibrant and opinionated. Jack came into the kitchen one morning to find her standing on a stool, her arms aching, her face a mask of fury as she tried to braid her own hair. It is not right," she grumbled, pulling the lopsided braid apart. Grace, kneading dough at the table, just smiled. "It takes practice. Emma, keep at it." Emma took a breath and began again. She was taking charge of her world. She no longer just watched in the kitchen. She helped. Her hands, dusted with flour, would proudly present Jack with a small, lumpy biscuit she had made herself. She was a flower, a perennial, that had been buried in the snow and was now, finally, blooming. The bread, Jack thought. As he watched them, the house always smelled of it now. The dough rose every single morning, a stable, living, reliable promise. The rhythm of the house was secure. The next time they were in town, Jack went to hitch the wagon for the ride home. He stopped. Tucked between the spokes of the front wheel was a small, woven basket. He looked around. The street was busy. No one was watching him. He lifted the basket. Inside were a dozen pale brown eggs, nestled in straw. There was no note. He looked over at the general store. The shopkeeper, the man who had sat at the deacon's table, was busy loading sacks onto another wagon. He did not look at Jack. He did not have to. It was the Western way. It was the apology. It was the truce. It was a hand, extended in action, not in words. Jack placed the basket in the wagon. When Grace climbed up, she saw it. Where did those come from? A neighbor, Jack said, gathering the reins. For Emma. Grace looked at the basket, then at him. She understood. The rift was mended. That evening, the air was soft, the first true hint of summer in it. They sat on the porch, the three of them. The day's work was done. The new garden was watered. The cattle were quiet. Emma, her head heavy with sleep, sat on the swing between them. The sound of the new meadowlark, the one that had sung in the dark rain, was now a clear, triumphant song from the cottonwood tree on the rise. Jack's hand found Grace's in the twilight. They sat, silent, listening to the new, warm world. Happiness, Jack realized, was not a thing you found. It was not a thing you were given. It was a thing you made. You built it like a fence. You tended it like a garden. You fought for it like a calf in the cold. You made it day by day with flower and wood and courage. The sun was a great, molten coin, resting on the sharp, dark line of the western mountains. It bled color into the high, thin clouds, painting the sky in shades of apricot and rose. The light, no longer the harsh, blinding white of winter or the pale, watery yellow of the thaw, was now a deep, rich gold. It poured over the valley, illuminating the new green of the meadows, turning the grasses to a field of liquid amber. The ranch house, once a dark, cold shape against the snow, was now the center of this warmth. Its logs seemed to glow. On the porch, the mended swing creaked, a low, contented sound in the twilight. Jack sat on one side, Grace on the other. Emma sat between them, her small legs dangling, not quite reaching the porch floor. She was quiet, her head tilted back, watching the colors change. They had been walking, the three of them, down to the creek to see the water, now clear and calm, running free. They had checked on the garden, where the bean shoots were pushing up in determined, green rows. Now, they were resting, a family, framed by the simple lines of the porch, bathed in the day's final, gentle light. Emma, holding a hand of each, swung her legs back and forth. She had been quiet for a long time, absorbing the peace of the evening. "Papa," she said, her voice small and clear, not directed at him, but at the sky. "Yes, sweetheart," Jack answered, his gaze on the horizon. She twisted, looking up at him. Her face was serious, her eyes searching his. It was the same direct, soul-deep gaze that had, in the middle of the winter, asked him if the kitchen would ever be warm again. She asked her new question, "Are you happy now, Papa?" It was not an accusation. It was not a plea. It was a simple, honest request for a final accounting. Jack turned his head. He looked at his daughter, truly looked at her. Her cheeks were no longer pale and pinched. They were round, dusted with sun and dirt. Her hair, in two thick braids she had mostly, proudly, done herself, was shining. Her eyes, once old and haunted, were just the eyes of a child, bright and curious and safe. His gaze lifted from Emma and met Grace's. Grace was watching them, a small, quiet smile on her face. She was no longer the worn, desperate traveler from the storm. The lines of grief and hardship were still there. They were part of her, but they were softened now by warmth and rest and belonging. Her eyes, meeting his, were full of the same steady, quiet love he had seen in the barn after the calf was born. He looked back at Emma. He felt the light inside his own chest, the thing that had been a cold, dead ember for 2 long years. It was not just lit, it was a full, steady, warm flame. "Yes," he said, his voice thick, but clear. "I am, sweetheart, I am." Emma smiled. It was a smile of complete, final satisfaction. She had her answer. The world was right. She leaned her head against his arm, content, and went back to watching the sky. Inside the kitchen, in the dimming light, a testament to that happiness was already at work. On the back of the stove, where the metal was still warm, a large wooden bowl sat, covered with a clean cloth. Inside, the dough for tomorrow's bread was in its first rise. It was a rhythm now, a given, as certain as the sunset. The bread was no longer a desperate act of survival against a temporary winter. It was a plan. It was the foundation of the next day, and the day after that. It was the future, rising slow and steady in the warmth. Jack watched the light fade. He thought of what it had taken to get here. He had believed, for so long, that to be happy, to feel this peace, was a betrayal. He had thought that loyalty to Mary meant living in the cold kitchen of the past, his heart as dead as the stove. He looked at Grace. She had been right. The heart was a big house. Mary was still there. She was in Emma's laugh, which was so like her own. She was in the hardy, beautiful flowers that blossomed on the hill, a flash of defiant color. She was in his own capacity for kindness, the part of him that Mary had nurtured and which he had almost frozen to death. Grace had not erased Mary. She had, with her quiet strength, simply opened the door to another room, a room he had not known was there. She had brought the light back and shown him it was not a sin to live in it. He finally understood. Living on, choosing to be happy, was not an act of forgetting. It was the bravest, most difficult act of remembrance. It was the only way to truly honor what had been lost. Their future was not a grand, spoken thing. It was a series of simple, solid assumptions. It was the garden, which they would harvest. It was the herd, which they would grow, with the new bull they had discussed. It was the town festival, which Mistress Wheeler had insisted they attend, with Grace in charge of the apple pies. There would be a wedding. He knew that. A simple one. In the fall, after the harvest, in the church, with Tom Wheeler and his wife as witnesses, and Emma, in a new dress, holding the wildflowers. But that was just a ceremony. The marriage, the true joining, had already happened. It had been forged in the kitchen, in the middle of the night, with the fever. It had been sealed in the barn, with the newborn calf. It had been declared in the middle of Main Street. Later, after Emma had been carried, heavy with sleep, to her bed, Jack and Grace came back out to the porch. The world was dark now, the mountains a black cut against a purple sky studded with stars. The first crickets of summer had begun their song, a steady, peaceful trilling. Jack sat on the swing. Grace sat beside him. He put his arm around her, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. Her hair was soft against his rough shirt. They did not speak. There were no words left that needed to be said. All the fear, the anger, the declarations, and the confessions were done. This, now, was the result. This was the maturity of their love. It was not the frantic, grasping passion of first youth. It was a quiet, solid, and deep knowing. It was the comfort of two people who had seen the worst of the world, and the worst of each other, and had chosen to stand together. It was trust. From the kitchen window, the light from the single lantern they left burning spilled out onto the porch, painting a warm, yellow square in the darkness. It was the same light that had first drawn Grace from the storm, the light she herself had lit. It was the heart of the house, no longer cold, shining out into the world. Jack looked out at the dark, peaceful valley. He felt Grace's steady breathing against his side. He heard the sound of the crickets, the promise of the warm, long days to come. This was the reward, this quiet, this simple, earned peace. Some people, Jack thought, said love came easy, a gift from the sky. But he knew the truth. He knew the truest kind, the kind that lasted, did not just arrive. It had to be built. It came from a hearth fire, and from bread, and from a terrible, and then a simple courage. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to hear from you. Please comment below with where you are listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.